The humanitarian doctrine of Swedish exceptionalism might have been a point of national pride and a marker of Swedish identity. That capacity has now been challenged by taking in the most refugees per capita of any European country. As the government moderates its more ambitious and idealistic commitments, what will inspire Swedes as time goes on? What are the sources of national pride as they face 21st century challenges of accommodating aging populations, strained welfare systems, and greater ethnic and religious diversity? What duty do they have to the other? What are Swedish values?
And that's a quote from...
It's a quote from Danielle Thompson, a PhD candidate of Columbia University, writing for Brookings.edu.
Yeah, and welcome to The Found Cause, where we found our cause in serving the Lord Jesus Christ. I've been Michael, the man behind the machine, and to my virtual front. First, it's...
Which one of us?
You just gave the quote, Theodore.
It's Theodore. Not a great intro.
This is a great intro.
Sorry. I'm Theodore, under the PC, under the person of Christ.
And last but not least, Sebastian, the archivist.
It is out of order, I agree. Normally it's Sebastian, then you, so sorry to throw you off. Today we're trying to cold open today, so thanks for bearing with us. Cold open means we don't start with the intro, we have a little quote. And so Theodore pulled a quote from us. The Swedish issue is not really the topic of the day, but it does give a good story of what we're talking about today. And it's in the news a lot. And we've done an episode kind of on it, but we feel like we can hit it more on the head in this one. It's super important because it shapes how we advocate for our religion to affect society, how we as Christians advocate in our daily lives, and what types of things we should push for, how we should attribute success of other countries. And generally, I hope that by the end of this episode, you can give glory to God in everything and not leave parts of your life or parts of your thinking cordoned off from his touch. That's the goal of this episode. You may, if you follow the news, you may have seen that Europe has gone through kind of an unprecedented immigrant wave reaction. There's a the media calls it far right. I don't really follow German politics enough to know to confirm that, but they are an anti-immigration party in Germany that has scored big wins in Germany, enough that the communists and the current German government have united against this party. So they've somehow found common ground between the communists and the current German government to try to keep the anti-immigrant party from coming into power. So they're really close. That's what it tells you. They have a lot of seats in German parliament. So there's a lot of anti-immigration sentiment in Germany. In France, there's been several riots against immigrants, and likewise, there's been riots from immigrants. In Sweden, there have been riots and murders in certain towns, cities. Malmo is a big city in Sweden that had a couple murders from immigrants that swept Swedish news. And this culminates in a couple of these countries in the EU. The EU had a policy of letting in immigrants from Syria, from North Africa, from Southern Sahara, Africa that's below the Sahara, Sub-Saharan, letting in refugees from countries where things are not going very well. And these countries are now separately, so not with the help of the EU, paying immigrants, offering to pay them a package to leave. It is a legitimate reaction enough that it's actually affected government policy in wanting these immigrants to
leave. Digitizing.
He's dying.
Am I back?
So what Michael was saying is that Sweden is actually now paying up to $34,000 for immigrants to leave their country. Denmark is offering like up to 15,000. Norway, Germany offering 2,000 or 3,000 for people to leave their country, to protect their country and their country's values, etc. Sorry, Michael, you were digitizing, so.
Yeah, my internet's not very good. It's just by recording, you can't see it, but they can see it. Thank you for letting me know. So all that to say, it's not just a Swedish problem. We don't really care about Sweden in this podcast or about Germany as far as, who such a small country as Sweden is, that why would we care? Except that for a while, Denmark, Sweden, Germany have been exceptionally successful countries. For such small populations, they have an incredibly high GDP per capita. People enjoy visiting there. A lot of ancestry comes from there in the United States, and they have warm relations, whereas a lot of Italian ancestry, for example, in the United States does not have warm relations with its Italian ancestors. A lot of Norwegian ancestors, for instance, here in Minnesota, go back to their families in Norway to say hi, or like long extended families, which doesn't happen often in some immigrant groups. And so we want to look at those societies that are exceptionally good and figure out why are they exceptionally good and why are they rightfully anti-immigrant and what it is about immigrants that aren't succeeding in Sweden, right? When similar immigrants, the United States has so many different immigrant movements that it's an easy one to point at. When Norwegian and German immigrants come to the United States, they didn't really cause a hubbub. They moved out to the sticks and they created the societies in the Midwest. But when Italians came to the United States, they caused a huge wave of anti-immigrant policy. Same with the Irish. And Hispanics now have caused a pretty large wave of anti-immigrant policy in the Southwest of the United States. When the Chinese first arrived, they did. And so is this just is it just racist reaction to people who look different? Or is it legitimate societal strain from different cultures moving in? Though we're talking about how religion affects culture. And I would say, just to get into the meat of this, so it becomes Christian, not just like a random political podcast, I argue that the thing that makes a society great is its culture. If you moved 1,000 Japanese people from Japan to a tiny island in the Pacific and took 1,000 tiny Pacific Islanders from the same island and moved them to Japan, the Pacific Islanders would have a very hard time in Japan, and the Japanese would probably be fine on the island because, I mean, it depends on who you're moving from Japan, of course. But just knowing the general productivity of Japanese people versus islanders, Japanese people are incredibly productive. And so we would say it's not the land necessarily that makes a good culture. It makes a good society. It's the culture of the people there. And as the pinnacle of this argument, some arguments would just stop there, stop at culture. But we define culture as the set of commonly held beliefs, otherwise known as a religion. So although Swedish Protestants and Protestant Americans would identify as roughly the same religion, clearly we're not the exact same religion because we don't bake lefse and the Swedish do, and we don't speak Swedish and they do. So we have a slightly different religion, even if it both points to the same, like it is still God fearing, it's attempting to fear God. They are slightly different, and you'll see that reflected in societal values, whether it's welfare or specific points of theology, etc. So we tolerate Presbyterians. We're all some sort of Baptist. We all tolerate Presbyterians. And so in the same way, we as Americans tolerate Swedish people. And we recognize that we could be wrong as Americans at some point of culture, and Swedes could be right. But we strongly disagree with cultures that believe in Islam, for example, right? That's a diametrically opposed culture to us. And so, again, at the root of culture, we would argue is religion, that all cultures are a religion. And so, of course, we're advocates of Christianity. And so we want our culture to best reflect Christianity. And we hope that other cultures do. And we would argue that the thing that makes Sweden exceptional to the rest of the world is their adherence to Christian values, to biblical values, to God's values from his law. And where they are unexceptional is where they veer from that. In the same way, where Americans are exceptional, it's where we adhere to biblical values and God's law, and where we aren't exceptional, it's where we don't. And the same goes for any culture, even those who don't claim to be Christian. Where they are exceptional is where they get closest to God's law, and where they aren't, it's where they veer from God's law. That's kind of the general thesis of our episode, and we want to talk it through. So I've said a lot. You guys have any comments? I want to highlight a particular society or movement that we would say reflects this principle that culture is religion and religion makes society good or bad?
And when you say God's law or principles of God, you mean Old Testament law, do you not?
Yeah, I mean, the New Testament gives us interpretation on how to apply God's law in the modern day. So I don't mean to ignore the New Testament, but the most specific laws of God are given all in the first 5 books of the Bible.
Nice.
And even with the 2 main commandments, love God and love your neighbor, there's plenty of caveats or clarifications or descriptions of that are more detailed in the Old and New Testaments, so that you kind of get a picture of, okay, love God. The Old and New Testament tell you who God is, and then loving others. Old and New Testaments tell you how to do that, and also to not be partial, except being more partial to believers, to your family, which make sense. You prefer your spouse and daughter over random immigrant, but that doesn't mean you look down on the immigrant. Like one of the episode that we did mentioning Bishop Marmari a while ago, we brought up the Quran verse. Oh, do I have this? Chapter 48, verse 29, which basically says that Muslims should be firm or forceful with unbelievers, but compassionate to Muslims. Whereas Christianity would say, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, but if you don't like provide for or protect your own family, then you're worse than an unbeliever. So it gives that kind of hierarchy, but nonetheless, you love everyone and you don't put somebody down or make somebody sit on the dirt. Whereas unrighteously preferring somebody else to, I don't know, sit on a throne kind of thing.
Right. And it's just one aspect of how Christian law plays itself out. Like you said, Theodore, the reason that America is so welcoming of immigrants by and large, I mean, you can argue there's many instances where America has not been, but we are the most immigrant-filled country, I think, in history. Again, maybe come up with some rivals, but at least we're on the top 5, is because of Christian values. And it's because we love our enemies. So even those who we know are diametrically opposed to our culture, we have still allowed the chance to come in. Now, in wisdom, we have decided to limit how many of those people come in and where, so that they don't end up being the dominant culture. Well, you don't want to be, in loving your enemies, you don't want to be overtaken by your enemies foolishly. Like, loving your enemy does not mean that you let a murderer go free, right? You punish a murderer. And so in the same way, we know that Catholic countries, for example, are diametrically opposed to Protestant values. But we have allowed Catholics to move to the United States, hoping that they will adhere to American culture, which is Protestant, created by Protestants for Protestants. And so we let them come in, we love them, right? We treat them with justice. We don't give them a different set of laws that they have to go by. They're allowed even to become citizens in this country. This is all predicated on the love your neighbor verses and to not oppress the foreigner among us. We don't make laws that judge foreigners differently than us. There are some exceptions, and I would say those exceptions are where American culture falls short, as far as like constitutional protections don't protect non-citizens. And so we have like Guantanamo Bay famously is a bay in Cuba. It's a military base in Cuba that Americans run. And we bring foreign nationals there that we believe to be terrorists, and we torture them. And you're not allowed to torture American citizens, but because they aren't American citizens, we torture them. Okay, I mean, you can argue that we should be able to torture American citizens, but it is an unequal treatment of the law to foreigner and non-foreigner. And, you know, I could argue that's falling short of God's law. However, by and large, American culture does treat foreigners the same as we treat Americans if they're in our borders by the law. And so we are trying to hold to God's law there. Whereas, as you can think of the many examples of foreign countries not treating people equally, Saudi Arabia, a famous country that treats foreigners by an entirely different law code. Even Japan has an entirely different law code for foreign nationals than it does for citizens. That's specifically ruled out. It is specifically less favorable to foreign nationals than Japanese. And, you know, again, argue whether or not you have the right to do that, but I don't think it's in the spirit of God's law. And maybe we should just list out the facts just to show why we conclude that Christianity is good for societies by facts, in that the United States is an extremely successful, extremely rich, extremely renowned country. I think no one can argue that the United States is not the most successful country on the face of the earth right now. You can argue it can get better. You can argue that it's not going to be on the top for a while, that there was better countries in the past, but right now it is the number one superpower in the world. The European West grew to be the number one superpower in the world as a unit, while they were very Christian. Think of powerful countries, and most of them are Christian, with a couple exceptions. And so I think those who would oppose our conclusion here that Christianity is what makes societies good would point to those countries that are good but aren't Christian. So I do think we should address some of those outliers. That the general trend is that good countries are Christian countries, successful countries are Christian countries, but maybe, Sebastian, I'm sure you can think of an exception to this.
The Inca Empire, the Caliphate of the Muslims, the Empire of Alexander the Great, China, a lot of China, not all dynasties, but Tang Dynasty, for example, they conquered all the way into Afghanistan.
Yeah, so
just some. We can keep going, but those are just some.
Yeah, and I think so. The positive Christian cultures should be really obvious. Europe, Canada, America. I think the one exception would be all of South America, which we would argue is a cult of Christianity, so not true Christianity. Catholicism has not had the same record of success in its later years, post Reformation.
For clarity, yes, the missionaries that were arriving into Latin America was already during the Counter Reformation, so a lot of influence from post the times, as you said, when Catholicism was good. I mean, I would argue there's a decline after the 1200s. We've done this in other videos, but by the 1500s, Catholicism was leaving the body of Christ.
Right. So those exceptions notwithstanding, hard to argue that Christian countries don't make up the majority of high GDP, high what's the humanity index, the Human Development Index, HDI, are mostly Christian countries, or post-Christian, as some would say, because a lot of European countries today are Christian majority, but they make up a minority. So like there are other religions / atheism that are competing for the majority position in Christianity, but at least they were all previously Christian. So let's talk the exceptions. So there are exceptions to that general rule, but it's hard to argue that rule doesn't exist. Let's start with the Inca Empire. Why were the Incans successful? Was it because they were getting close to Christianity, or were they countering Christianity and doing something Christianity does not, and that was making them successful?
I would say neither. To the best of my knowledge, we don't have, unless we're Mormons, there's no knowledge of the gospel in the Americas before the arrival of the Spanish or the English or any European. So they conquered a lot of land, and they conquered really well, and then they ruled it well until the Spanish showed up and disease and war destroyed them.
Right, but the question is, so even without knowing about Christianity specifically, were the Incans adhering to Christian values, or were they breaking Christian values and still succeeding? Like, what were the things they were rebelling against in God's law, helping them succeed?
I suppose that you could say the Inca codified a better system of law that had existed previously in that part of the world by being very strict on not stealing, murder, or things like fornication. To the best of my knowledge, they eliminated human sacrifice. Okay, I understand there was a few exceptions, but they mostly eliminated the practice of human sacrifice. So, I mean, that has to be a plus.
Certainly it's closer to Christian values, which of course outlaws human sacrifice, and also outlaws stealing and murder and rape and fornication. So you could be tempted to attribute Incan success to biblical values, even if they didn't know what the Bible was. They were adhering to God's law without knowing it.
They definitely had a better way of running society. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to compete with their neighbors and take them over.
And so it would be hard. So I think the challenge here is that in a country like the Incan Empire, they weren't being compared to Christian countries until the Christian countries arrived. So being better than all the nations around you is, you'd have to argue that the reason the Incans thrived was because of something outside of Christian values that Christian values would never bring, that makes Incan values greater than Christian values, or at least as good as Christian values without having to be biblical. Because again, our argument here is that whether you know it or not, biblical law is the best way to run a country. And so when you get close to biblical law, whether you know it or not, it is a better way to run your country, and you will become more successful. And so we're arguing here that the Incans aren't actually an exception to the rule. Even though they weren't Christian, the reason they succeeded versus the Chimu or whoever, some other nation that they took over, is because they adhered more to God's law than their neighbors did. And so they were able to conquer them or just have a better society than them, because they didn't have human sacrifice, or they didn't allow stealing, murder, fornication.
Very important to mention, we would say that God has, all people are made in the image of God. Not everyone is a child of God, but all humans reflect to some degree or another, depending on how much you suppress it, the principles, the attributes of Yahweh, as far as a mortal can do it. So humans all over the planet have the ideally uncorrupted desire to not steal or not stab someone else. And that's how you can see societies that discover these principles and put them into practice. They tend to be more successful than tribes that are okay with pillaging and raiding, and suddenly they get raided and destroyed completely. So that will be something also to keep in mind of why you can see places across the world that we would say haven't had contact with Christianity. I would say China did at one point, but humans have this, it's inner, how would you say, inner, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the Romans 1 even talks about it, that the law of God is written in our hearts. Even if we aren't Christians or don't know of God, it's written in our hearts, and the evidence of a creator is obvious in his creation. So whether you're born in the ancient Incan Empire or you're born in modern day Manhattan, you have the same intrinsic knowledge of God, in that you know what's right and know what's wrong, and you have to choose to suppress it, to turn against it.
And then what we were saying is that some societies have gone off the rails. Like, for example, the Chimu, I'm impressed that you brought that up. They were very much for sacrificing the firstborns of pretty much the nobles, but also sometimes like the merchants and the middle-class families. And that's pretty bad for society. Not only does it cause everyone to hate the priesthood at some point, they're going to rise up and stab you back, but also destroys the demographics of your country. Not only assuming, of course, that this is all evil and you're heaping on yourself the wrath of God, so someone else is eventually God's going to use someone else to take you out for the sins that they're piled up. And we have evidence from that in scripture, like God uses that as other nations as judgment for the sins that a nation does.
And I've heard this, you mentioned them, and I've heard Muslims argue against Christianity in this very way as well. The question is, the Muslims conquered, so the Incas got conquered by Christians. So kind of easy to say, like, they were the best of their time, except when Christians came, then they weren't the best, because now they had Christians compared to. Muslims conquered the Eastern Roman Empire, which was a Christian empire by the point that they got conquered, and they conquered the Zoroastrian Persian Empire, which was minority Christian, so still there were Christians there. Doesn't that show that Islam, when directly compared to Christian societies, was a better society because it was able to conquer them? In some ways, yes, because I would say there's many arguments on why exactly the great Eastern Roman Empire and the great Persian Sassanid dynasty fell to the Islamic invasions. But one of them would be that the Muslims had a cohesive goal and were adhering to God's law better than Eastern Romans or the Zoroastrianists, Sassanids, the Persians, in that they were honoring their families more. They were holding to tight-knit society that allowed for male headship, and they were able to organize great and honorable hordes to invade. I mean, you could try to argue that they were a more righteous society, and maybe they were trying to adhere to God's law. But I would point to the after effects of that invasion. So the invasion itself, I think, does more or less prove a better society, and that they were at the time better than Eastern Romans and the Sassanids. They took them over, they took their land, they took their people. And I would say what's really telling is they took the richest land in the entire world at that point. The center of civilization had been the Middle East for years, and despite wars and demographic changes, whatever else, it was still the center of the world at the time. And they took it all over, which means not only did they get the things and the geography and the riches and the resources, but the people as well, because they didn't kill everybody. I mean, basically they just gained the cities that were there before. So the same people are there, the same super smart people, the same schools and institutions were mostly untouched. It was mostly the government that changed. And yet, so they inherited they combined the two richest societies in the world at that time, the Eastern Romans and the Sassanids, maybe the exception of China, but two of the richest societies. So you'd expect them to be incredibly rich. And they were. There's something called the Golden Age of Islam, and they were rich, but they stagnated. They stopped being the richest in the world. Basically, as soon as they consolidated their rule, they stayed the same amount of rich, which is telling, because a righteous society does not sit on its talents. It doesn't sit on its talents and not gain. It gains. It produces. It increases its produce. It increases its richness. And so, what did Islam do during its time at the top of the world? Like we attribute the letter 0 to Islam, but it's really from, I think, India. It's coming out, and likely from Nestorian scribes, so Christian scribes, not Islamic scholars themselves. And then,
that I can certify, yes, with first-hand sources that the Nestorians were pretty annoyed at the Arabs. It's like, you keep stealing all their stuff. You know, what good has come from the Arabic language? You just keep taking everything from Syro Aramaic. And so all the reason, before any atheist or non-Christian says that the Muslims preserved Aristotle and the Greek philosophers and all those writings, no, that's not true. The Nestorians had been copying them in their monasteries and big centers of learning like Seleucia and eventually Baghdad before the Muslims arrived. So then when the Muslims showed up, they just grabbed all the Nestorian scribes and threw them into Baghdad and say, we're going to pay you to just keep translating the stuff and make them into Arabic now. So that's how they got that's how the West got the Greek writings from antiquity, because the Nestorians had preserved it. It's not something that came out from Muslim or Arabic writers.
And this is tenuous because it's really hard to really do this kind of history, but geographical history tends to show that the Fertile Crescent and Muslim-owned areas were far more arable and richer as like producing places like grain and things that would have been the most value at the time, grain and paper and, creating goods, wealth. They were far more valuable before Arabs took over. And so while Arabs remained really rich because they owned the richest places on the earth, they became less rich. And now when you look at Baghdad, it's a pile of garbage versus it used to be the culmination of all of the Sassanids' wealth into one city, where the Muslims, like you said, took all the scribes, the building materials, the money they earned, the taxes they were levying, and put it in to Baghdad. Now it's not nice. And in the same way, North Africa used to be the crown jewel of the Roman Empire, the Christian Roman Empire, and used to be producing a ton of grain, so much so that when they lost it during different invasions, it like catapulted Rome into total darkness and distress. Muslims have taken over Northern Africa, and I don't know if anybody's seen Northern Africa these days, but not exactly the super rich nations that it would have been in when it was originally taken over. So the long-term non-success of the Arabs is telling that they really don't run a good society in the long term compared to Christians. Now, did they at the time take over weaker cultures? Granted, yes, and those cultures had become bad, but they themselves aren't good. It's kind of the Inca scenario again. Like, did the Inca take over the Chimu? Yeah, but the Chimu were bad. So, and it doesn't really elevate the Inca to say that they beat the Chimu, and in the same way, it doesn't really elevate Muslims to say they beat the Sassanids or the Eastern Romans.
Mm-hmm. I would like to give a specific example I think contributes on how this actually goes against the law of God. And the jizya, one of the things that pumped pretty much the equivalent of oil money back in the Dark Ages was jizya, tax money, that extra taxes that Muslim levied on non-Muslim populations, specifically Christian, Nestorians, Copts, Orthodox that lived in the Levant and Egypt. And North Africa too, the Catholics in North Africa. At one point they started realizing, people are trying to convert now. There's less tax money that we're getting from all these people that we just conquered that we're charging extra money from. And eventually there was some desire for people to stop converting, but they just kept on converting to Islam to avoid paying that extra tax. But my point is that they relied on pretty much, I would like to say, servitude, slave labor borderline, and the we can see other examples too later on, that when you use these forms of laws in society, for example, that justify servitude or slavery, it is bad for you. It goes against the way Yahweh meant a society to be run, and it shows. It makes your country stagnant, sad, and it hurts you.
Yep, and maybe it's worth sidetracking here, because Islam is such a major influence even today, and it's an influence in these immigrants that are moving into Europe, as we started this episode as. Did you want to talk a little bit about Sharia law, Theodore, and like modern day Muslim countries, not just medieval, but modern day Muslim countries, and how they show this same pattern?
Yeah. So, where do you start on this? So I was like the most dangerous countries for Christians. And North Korea, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, Pakistan, Yemen, Iran, Sudan, Nigeria, India come up, along with there's like a list of 50 also. Probably plenty of lists, but so North Korea, their religion per se is worshiping their supreme leader, basically. But then all these other and then India, 80% Hindu, 15% Muslim. And what I gather from you guys is that the Hindus persecute both Muslims and Christians.
Very much so.
And then in all the others, it's like 80-90% Muslim population, if not 100%. And there's a lot of persecution of Christians. Nigeria is interesting because there's 50% Muslims, 48% Christian, but more believers are still killed for their faith each year than everywhere else in the world combined in Nigeria. From being abducted and held for ransom or driven from their homes. And when you look at Sharia law, which will most likely be in a Muslim-dominated country, in one way or another, there's a lot of different classifications. It might be classic, mixed. Some is supposedly for Muslims only. But even if it's not mandated for you, there's still like a cultural acceptance of persecuting or treating Christians or minorities poorly. And so a couple more things in Sharia law. I'm not sure where exactly you wanted to go, but like if you convert from Islam to Christianity, that could be a death penalty. And if it's not like a legal death penalty, then it's an acceptable honor killing, basically, to restore honor to your family. And then you could also be deported or taken into custody for sharing your faith or gathering for church. So these sorts of things, like America, we have this freedom of religion, which is enshrined in our Constitution. But these other countries, whether it be North Korea, Muslim-dominated country, even India, it's not so much freedom of religion and its adherence to their, I guess, perverted law of God kind of thing. And it's more so ethnically or culturally based or emphasized as opposed to biblically based. That's my sense of it.
Yes, and I think it should be a point to the first part of our thesis here, that is that a society is run by its culture. It's not the land or some other external thing. The culture is the society. And so when you have a mixed culture in a society, like while there are Muslim and Hindu Indians, they are primarily Hindu Indians or Muslim Indians. Like they are different cultures based off of their religion. And so when you have a mixed culture, you you really can't have neutrality. I think this is something we are learning as a church in the West these days, is that it's something we used to know, is that there is no neutrality in the world. You are either for God or against God. You're either for something or against something. You can't really just tolerate something unless you know it's slowly losing, right? So in the case of India, the Indians are persecuting Muslims and Christians because they know that Muslims and Christians are both trying to affect society, as they should, right? If you think your culture is the best, you're going to try to make the whole world that culture. And so they're trying to eradicate a culture they think will beat them. Ultimately, right? There's a reason Christians don't typically persecute cultures inside their countries, because we believe in the prevailing victory of Christianity. And so even if our country is 40% Muslim, we believe that Christianity, and 60% Christian, we believe that Christianity will ultimately prevail against Islam, because it's a better society, it's a better religion, it's the truth, right? It's the true God, whereas Allah is the fake God. Muslims, Hindus, people who persecute other religions with fervor typically think they're on the losing side and want to eradicate it so that they can keep it out, because if it comes in, it may win. And so that's why I think Christians shouldn't have a scared view of encountering Muslims, encountering Hindus in the United States or abroad, because our religion is truth and it will beat Islam, it will beat Hindus. We don't have to be scared of it. But it goes to show that those societies, Nigeria, for instance, thinks it's in the Muslims of northern Nigeria think they're in an existential war that requires the death of Christians to keep their society alive. Same with India or Afghanistan or wherever else. And the punchline to all of this is that if you believe that Islamic law, Sharia law, which, like you said, Theodore, has a million different ways it can be interpreted, so it's not a uniform law, but anywhere it is tried in some flavor, it fails. It is not a good society. Afghanistan, run by the Taliban, there are many people who disagree with the Taliban's particular flavor of Sharia law, but it is evident that the Taliban has taken Afghanistan's tremendous resources, which is kind of funny to say because Afghanistan is such a, not rich country right now, but they are historically a very valuable tract of land. It's where Alexander the Great spent a ton of time conquering because he thought it was so rich, and it was. It's a center of trade for a lot of different parts of the world. It has historically been a conqueror's homeland, like it's the conqueror's homeland that conquered India and came the Mughal Empire. It is a historically rich and valuable piece of land, but Islam, specifically Sharia law Islam trying to conform to Islamic law standards, has made it bad. It's not just American interventionism or Russian interventionism or Sikh interventionism or Persian interventionism. It is the land itself is ruled by a culture that is bad, and they have made it bad. And so the same goes for northern Nigeria versus southern Nigeria, which is a perfect example. Same nation. The top half is Muslim and the bottom half is Christian. The bottom half is rich and growing. The top half is stagnant and gross. Now, the top half also happens to be like not rich desert land, but you wonder if it would be that way if it was Christian, kind of like the Middle East. I wonder how poor and sad and deserted it would be, and literally desert, if it were Christian, or if people were putting their nose to the grindstone and de-desertifying the desert. You can be done, and people do it. Yeah, I digress. But the proof is in the pudding in that not only are these nations afraid of other religions, they're also failing when they have the majority. They have the majority in Afghanistan, and it is still a bad nation. They have the majority in Iran, and it is still a stagnating bad nation. They have the majority in Iraq, and it's still a stagnating, failing nation. India may be the only exception, except they are probably the richest country on earth by natural resources. And so you think of them as kind of squandering the richest country on earth if they aren't approaching the richest country on earth in GDP. So,
and you mentioned like there are different flavors of Islam and interpreting Sharia law. Mm-hmm. Maybe now is a good time to mention the CIA, United States Central Intelligence Agency, has a list of 60 terrorist organizations on their website. And I'd say probably 55 of those are terrorist organizations that are try to adhere to Islam. The website has like their stated goals on it, and the goals are to establish an Islamic State or Sharia law, or exterminate Israel, Western influence, and or religious minorities. So with that many terrorist organizations, and they're 95% Islam related, that kind of gets you to question, I guess, where they're getting it from. And obviously, we've had that previous podcast talking about the Quran and the verses, and how one can definitely more easily come to a point of violence in Islam and subjugating infidels or unbelievers just by reading that. I'm not exactly sure where I was going with this. But
well, you're showing again that they have an outsized bad influence on the world.
right.
You could even see nations that were Islamic but then move away from Islam, like Kazakhstan, Turkey, for example. The standard of living in those countries it's higher than places like Afghanistan that tries to adhere to the core tenets of Islam. I mean, that would be worth looking at too, considering.
Right. I mean, notoriously, Kazakhstan is more tolerant of other religions, right? And so there are lots of foreign nationals in Kazakhstan. Happens to be Russian or Orthodox. Not that we think that Russian Orthodox is Christians, but they are closer to Christian law than Islam. And so you wonder if their tolerance of better cultures than their own is actually bettering their culture, right? The evidence would seem to show that I would not call it a fluke that countries like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, that are currently growing in their GDP and succeeding more than they were, also have sizable minority Christians or people, again, law that is allowing for Christianity.
So in other words, they're moving away from strict adherence to Islamic law.
Right. Their culture is becoming more like God's law, more like Christian law. Let's keep, so we've slammed on Islam, which is still super relevant. The Incas are gone, so easy to dismiss them. Muslims are still super relevant today, so that's why we wanted to spend so much time on it. How about the Chinese? The Chinese, historically not Christian, historically very powerful, still very powerful. How do we explain the Chinese being so successful when they are currently antithetical to Christianity, and they have been several times throughout history? They've been they knew of Christianity and they were persecuting of it.
So that's fascinating because of a lot of there's a lot of paganism, superstition in China. There's been historically, probably same as today, even if they don't like to admit it. But the teachings of Taoism and Confucianism, they, oddly enough, every once in a while line up with the commandments of how God expects a society to be run. So what we've been saying from the start is, the more that you align with the commandments and precepts of God, the more successful your nation will be. Not because of the ethnic makeup of the people, but rather because you are following what the creator of the universe thinks is a good way to run a society.
And just for example, so Confucianism, pretty famous religion in China. Some would not call it a religion because China's super anti-religion, but they've had periods of state atheism. They're currently in a period of state atheism, but they know that Confucianism is such a strong religion that they have decided to call it not a religion, but a philosophy. So a lot of the politics around what you call Chinese religions are just politics, so that you can continue Confucianism even though you're in a state atheism country. And the fact that China tolerated Confucianism even in their most staunchly atheist days, a couple exceptions. Sometimes they were super anti-Confucianist because it is a religion, but it was the first one they tolerated is because it is a religion and it is China's national religion, essentially. Confucianism is very famously pro-parent, pro-ancestors, which is, in Christianity, we'd call it the first commandment with a promise. In the 10 Commandments, it says, honor your father and mother so that it will go well for you. This is probably the principal thing of God's law about how a society runs well, is if you honor your father and mother. Of course, the principal laws are love God and love your neighbor, which the Confucians do not love God. They abhor God. They just try to love their neighbor. So again, half the law, half a good society. If you do that half law perfectly, it's pretty good. 50%, that's a fail, but it's, better than a 20%. Just for proof, you can look it up yourself. But many Confucius quotes about honoring your family. Here's one from Confucius. There are 3 degrees of filial piety, meaning familial, honoring your ancestors being good. The highest is being a credit to our parents. The second is not disgracing them. The lowest is simply being able to support them. So he's saying, even at your lowest, even if you are the lowest of society, you should still be supporting your parents, which by and large is honoring your parents, which is what Jesus also says in the New Testament. He says that the Pharisees who would say you do not have to support your parents are breaking the law of God, which says honor your father and mother. So honor your father and mother does include taking care of your parents, which Confucius would agree for as well. Here's another Confucius quote. The superior man, while his parents are alive, reverently nourishes them, and when they are dead, reverently sacrifices to them. His thought to the end of his life is how not to disgrace them. Honoring your parents, clearly it's not Christianity because it involves reverently sacrificing to your ancestors. So I want to highlight that Confucius is not Christian, but he is, even in his God hatred of, sacrificing to your ancestors, he is honoring your father and mother. So on one hand, he's disobeying God. On the other hand, he's obeying God. And that's why we would argue Chinese society was more and very strictly adherent to like half of God's law than the nations around it, which is why it has grown to such a juggernaut today, because it has kept such a consistent obedience to these laws. And the times when China wasn't adhering to these cultures, it has struggled. There's a couple, not to get into crazy Chinese dynasty history, but if you know your Chinese dynasty history, you'll know that some dynasties were stronger and more rational than others, and usually it's because they adhered to God's law stronger. The current Chinese regime has seen incredible GDP growth, and yet we all know the problems of the current Chinese regime. It's probably one of the few times that the Chinese population has started a downwards turn when there has been no war or famine or any craziness. That goes to show they're probably taking the richest nation on earth historically. And even more than India, even more than the US, they've taken the most historically consistently richest country on earth, and they are still failing to keep society together in just a span of less than 100 years have they owned the country, which is pretty sad. That puts them on par with some of the worst dynasties in Chinese history. So sad. But proves the point that culture is what makes a nation, and the Chinese culture has long been a God-fearing culture. Even if they didn't fear the God of the Bible, they feared God's law. Yeah. Japan is another example. It's kind of similar to China in that they're very cohesive. So when they are pushing a certain culture, they push it hard. And so they're really consistent with whatever their religion is. And their religion has been one that honors ancestors, one that honors loving your neighbor and being just to your neighbor. And so though they hate God, by and large, they love their neighbors. And so that is what, again, we would argue has made them such a strong culture. That's pretty hard to argue against, considering how cohesive they are and how much they do adhere to honoring their parents even today and honoring each other. And yet we all know Japan's issues today. They have boomed in the 80s, post-World War II, and yet they've stagnated today. And I think it's because half the law is not as good as 80% of the law, which is probably what the United States has, right? We have something more than just the familiar honoring side in the US. We also have actually fearing the Lord. And so that helps us grow. It helps make more people that are productive. It helps create more productive families and more just law systems. And that's why the United States continues to develop, I believe, when Japan stagnates. What are other atheist nations? I mean, this one's kind of a sad argument, but yeah, the post-Christian nations in Europe have sizable atheist minorities. Typically, I think Norway may be an atheist majority, but atheists.
Czech Republic is atheist majority, I'm pretty sure.
Czech Republic is atheist majority. So there are a couple handful of nations that are truly atheist majorities, but they're all post-Christian in that they're atheists, but they're atheists with a Christian flair. And honestly, the longer they are atheist, I think the more truly atheist they become instead of like Christian atheist. And the more truly atheist they become, the more those countries struggle to succeed. Like the Czech Republic has historically been an incredibly rich, tiny little nation. Bohemia is like one of the richest nations in medieval Europe. And what do you know the Czechs to do today? Make guns? Like they are historically a very rich nation. They should be on the level of Italy richness, but they aren't. And I would attribute it to many things, but one of them being their culture is waning. Same for Russia. I mean, Russia's got to be the most notorious example of atheism gone mad, in that they were very Eastern Orthodox, so not Christian, but Eastern Orthodox, and they went atheist. And while I don't like Eastern Orthodoxy, it is better than atheism. And going atheist destroyed the entire country. Like, they took the most populous country on earth, besides China, and I guess a unified India, which didn't exist, and burned it to the ground. And now Russia can't even beat Ukraine in a war. They are demographically declining, just like China. And their GDP, which is entirely propped up by oil. So they have the biggest oil reserves, biggest oil refineries on earth, which is the gold of today. They still struggle to be in the top 10 GDPs. So another classic example of a great nation, like Islam. They take one of the richest resources on earth, people and things, and squander them. So I think Russia proves the point that atheism had failed there.
And unfortunately, Russia, at least last year, they had the most abortions in the world. I mean, obviously, the ones that you can track. So it does not bode well for the nation.
Well, they're also demographically declining. Like, they have less population, but that's been happening for a while, and a lot of it has to do with immigration as well. So tell us in the comments. We've been through a couple. We went through Russia, China, India, Middle East with Islam, Inca, Japan, I guess Korea, like pre-Christian Korea. They
were really sad. No.
I mean, they got dominated by the Chinese, right? So I wouldn't argue that they were superior.
Yeah. No. They were absolute, I mean, they probably even agree with me, the Confucians back in the day. They were Korea is meant to lick the boots of China. That's how they saw themselves. So, no. The country thrived once they became Presbyterian and Catholic, potentially. So, you might be saying, I mean, do you want to talk about within Christian countries how to be even more fair?
Sure. Do you have something in mind?
Yes. I mean, I would say even when Western Europe and Eastern Europe need to start to warm up a little bit before going to the juicy one. Eastern Europe allowed for serfdom and institutionalized the practice of serfdom, and the commandments of God says if you're going to have indentured servitude, which is different than actual servitude, what took place in places like the Kievan Rus, or not even later on, in Russia. It's bad. It makes it, practically speaking, it even makes not only is it immoral, but it makes the people complacent and incompetent. The rulers of the nation rely on pretty much slavery to run the country, and compared to the not owning of people until, yes, of course, sadly enough, later in the 1600s, as slavery was introduced to Europe, the West thrived much more compared to Eastern Europe, even though they were both Christian.
And I think you were starting to say God's law allows for indentured servitude, but only for 7 years. And then at max 40 years, even for foreigners that you take. So the
Russians didn't do that. They you say you can be an indentured servant, but you can stay for the rest of your life
and your kids' lives and their kids' lives. And it's not to just poke fun at Russians that did this, because a lot of nations did this, but that is bad, and it slowed them down. Evidently, it hurt their society.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, compared to countries that abolished that, like England, and the sun never sets in the British Empire. So I think that, for example, not enslaving your people is a good principle that Yahweh thinks is good for society. And the other example I was thinking of would be the United States. Before recording, I mentioned a long time ago, I read this book from Alexis de Tocqueville, a French aristocrat who traveled across the US to comment on American society. And he noticed that the North, people were more, not only were they more religious, but also they were more productive, honest, and overall he saw the North as eventually becoming wealthier and more powerful than the South. This was before the US Civil War. And when he traveled to the South, he saw that the aristocrats were incompetent, dull, and it was for these families that owned slaves in the South. It was only the mostly the primary son would be the main heir. So then all the other children, they were just squandering the family's wealth doing nothing, because they're not going to get a job running the plantation. It's only going to be like the firstborn that gets the plantation. So he saw a lot of not only abuse towards other humans done by the slave masters to the poor slaves, but just overall incompetence in society. And the reason I bring this up, as we all know, the US was a Christian nation back during the Civil War. So when the North, we would make the case, aligned itself more with how God thinks a society should be run, meaning don't enslave random people and keep them as property for their entire lives and never ever release them within the allowed time frame, that society is going to be better. It's going to reflect not only economically, but also in the mindset and the behavior of the people in such society.
And it became their defining sin. They endorsed their defining sin, and man stealing. So ultimately what chattel slavery is man stealing is a death-worthy offense in the Bible, in God's law. So when you embrace a death-worthy sin as your defining characteristic, which I come from the South, I have a lot of love for Southern culture that is distinct from American Northern culture. It has some good things, but so many will argue that that this wasn't the case, but I think it is historically undeniable that the Southern United States made it their defining characteristic slavery. That's why they were so existentially threatened when slavery was potentially going to be forced out of their hands by the president. Again, there's many arguments on whether they had the right to. I don't really need to get into that, except to say that the South was a distinct culture from the North, and distinctly a different religion than the North. They even split the Baptist convention so that they could condone slavery in the South while still abhorring it in the North. The nation suffered. And I would still say the Southern United States, Dixieland, was more righteous than Mexico, more righteous than modern day Middle East Muslim countries. So don't forget that 50% of law or 60% of law is still better than 20% of law. So when you're comparing the North to the South, you're comparing like 80% fulfillment of the law to 60%. The 80% is going to be better. So we mean to say that the North was better than the South for many years, but the South still adhered to many parts of God's law and was still better and still rich. It was still a rich area compared to many parts of the world, even with their defining sin. But they had a defining sin that ultimately God crushed. So, we don't mean this to be a ethnic thing. And I think that's super important to note too. The fact that we are calling the thing that makes societies great culture, and that culture is primarily religion made public, means that anybody, black, white, yellow, old, young, from different places of the world, from North America, from wherever, can be an American cultured person if they change their mindset. Their heart is changed by God so that they conform to his image. Like that's the hope that there is in religion being the primary source of culture successes, is that it doesn't matter whether the Southerners were white, because they still were worse than Northerners because they still disobeyed God's law. And likewise, it doesn't matter that Southern Nigerians are black and have in their ancestral blood, many generations of wicked pagans. They currently are trying to adhere to God's law, and so they are succeeding over their Northern compatriot neighbors who have similar ancestries and are just Muslim and adhering to the wrong law. So the hope here for the whole world is that it's not an ethnic thing. It's not an ethnic domination thing. We don't need to conquer other nations to make them better. God's law makes them better. And so we just need to convince them that God's law is good and that they start implementing it and see its fruit to make them better. And the same for this United States. We don't need another civil war to restore the United States or make the United States better than it ever was. We just need to make God's law the law of the land.
Fair enough.
And maybe something I wanted to mention in the episode, just because it gets brought up a lot in the U.S., is multiculturalism versus assimilation. I hear the arguments from people who say that we should have we should allow for multiple cultures in a nation. They claim Some of them just like arbitrarily say diversity is our strength and close their ears and run into the closet and hide. Those people clearly are not rational. But those who say diversity is our strength, in that diversity lets us see many different interpretations of God's law, and therefore we might be wrong on some things, and somebody that we didn't expect to be right might be right on something, and they can correct us. Okay, I hear that. So in that way, we want to be tolerant to a point of people who interpret God's law differently in the US so that we can change culture to be better, right? So they have something better, like making pizza, I guess, is some interpretation of God's law applied out into the use of our hands and chemistry to make good pizza. And so that has bettered American culture, that Italian vision of God's law and the world. So that's cool. I think there's danger, of course, in multiculturalism in that you might get pizza, but then you also get like gangsters. And so you want to do your best in multiculturalism to not keep it multiculturalism, to quickly decide what parts of this culture are good and should be enact and what parts are bad and should be annihilated, right? Assimilated, you might say. So
your standard being, again, the law of Yahweh before.
And annihilation meaning like change your law, not killing you. So for the record, right? And that's the hope here. Again, it should be the hope is that we don't need to annihilate people. We just need to annihilate philosophies,
bad
right?
Beliefs.
Religions. Yeah, bad beliefs, exactly. Which does not require the annihilation of people. And that is that right there is a revolutionary Christian unique idea, because atheism, in all its attempted copies of Christianity, explicit attempted copies of Christianity, still thought you should annihilate people, which, that's the failure of atheism. And of course, Hinduism and Muslims and every other religion out there, Buddhism wants to annihilate people, not just their thoughts.
Well, so does Islam. You're supposed to put all the enemies of Islam to the sword or submission, but it's by conquest.
Right.
They impose it.
So I guess all that to say, multiculturalism is only as good as it's bringing good into the nation. It is not good in and of itself, and it can hurt a country. So assimilation is very important, but you should only assimilate knowing that you are assimilating somebody to something good, not just for the sake of assimilation. So we like Americans like hamburgers. I am not so convinced that hamburgers are the righteous food of choice that I would force everybody to like hamburgers that came into the United States, because maybe it's not the food of choice. A pizza might be better, or pho. Like, there's a lot of different foods out there that could be better than hamburgers. Okay, that's why we tolerate different foods. And I would hope one day the United States has a definitive menu of the things that are good, and we leave all the garbage behind. We leave the Norwegian food that is disgusting behind, and only keep the great sweets they make, right? Or we leave all the old English food that's really bad behind, and we only keep the great English food. So we're constantly trying to improve food, and in the same way, we're also trying to improve laws. I don't think America has perfect laws. I don't know who does think America has perfect laws. And so if immigrants come in and say, hey, we should really stop this abortion thing, I'm like, high five, great, let's keep that, and let's leave the socialism behind. So I don't want people to assimilate to Americanism. I want them to assimilate to God's law. And as far as assimilating to Americanism means assimilating God's law, I'm pro it. But as far as assimilating to Americanism means leaving God's law, I am anti it. So I guess I'm pro becoming more godly. So multiculturalism is only as good as it is introducing more godly things. And if it's not introducing more godly things, it should be eliminated. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm pro multiculturalism, but not for the reasons that a lot of people are.
Yep, and I think the God is glorified in different societies being transformed in different ways by His righteousness and His righteousness alone. Such as, for example, what a fascinating thing would it be if China became a Christian nation? They can have all their delicious foods. They can have their own unique architecture, way of outfits, dressing, and just have a society that aligns itself with the values of Jesus Christ, the Lord. Or Nigeria, imagine if Boko Haram just stopped their savage killing and submitted to Jesus Christ. Nigeria would be a wonderful nation. And so we're not saying abandon your traditions or customs, just saying conform the beliefs of what informs your life or the life of people in a country to the precepts of Yahweh, Jesus Christ. And I do have a solution on the food thing. I mean, Peru has been nominated best food in the world for 10 plus years in a row, and keeps going until probably the return of Jesus Christ himself. We should just adopt Peruvian food and then problem solved.
Yeah, I mean, but even Peru, see, this is why Peruvians should let hamburgers in, just in case hamburgers are better than some Peruvian dish. You never know. And we should also let Peruvian food in here. And maybe it will dominate. If you're right, it will naturally dominate. Kind of the, what's the guy in the Bible? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting my Bible quizzes. Jewish teacher, famous Jewish teacher, who says, if the Christians are right and Jesus is the Messiah, then let them live. And if he's not, they're going to, let them, if he's not the Messiah, then they'll fizzle out like everybody else. So that's what I say about food too, is it's not existential, and therefore it's not outlining God's law specifically. So I say, let it be. Any closing thoughts, Theodore?
Well, this just shows the importance of assimilation and reasonable immigration. And from Sweden's Minister for Migration, this person says, this development towards sustainable immigration is necessary to strengthen integration and reduce social exclusion. And so what happens when you let immigrants in and they don't assimilate? Well, then you end up paying them $34,000 to leave. So it's kind of similar if you let them stay versus well, not necessarily. You kind of maintain your country, I guess, if you pay them to leave, and if they stay, it might become their country instead of remain your country. But yeah, like you're saying, strengthening the integration of God's law and increasing social inclusion by having everybody benefit from God's law. Mm-hmm. And also on opendoors.org, one of the dangerous places for Christians, again, Colombia. And supposedly it's 95% Christian nation. Now it's not necessarily ruled by a Christian. And
it's Roman Catholic as well.
And a lot of control of the territories are from armed guerrillas, war gangs, drug gangs, and other armed groups. So one important thing with God's law is to actually have a government that is able to protect the innocent. And that's also an incredibly important part of God's law. And Jesus explicitly says, if you cause one of these little ones to sin or hurt one of these little ones, and it's better for you to have a millstone hung around your neck and be thrown into the sea. So that's an important part, protecting the values of the country, protecting being able to enforce God's law for the safety of the citizens, and having immigrants assimilate into that so that they can know God's law, that they can know they're safe, that they can contribute and whatnot.
Yeah, and I think this is probably the biggest sticking point on immigration issues between the right and left that I think could be solved. A lot of them wouldn't be solved because we actually fundamentally disagree. But this one, I think we do fundamentally. Who disagrees that having immigrants that obey the current laws of the land that we currently agree with would be good? Nobody, because by definition we agree with the laws of the land. I think the only reason you wouldn't want immigrants that obey the current laws of the land is if you want the current laws of the land to change. So I think we all, assuming we all agree with our current laws of the land, at least, the ones we agree with, we want people obeying those laws of the land. And everybody agrees, I think, by and large, without exception in the United States, that we shouldn't have murder and stealing and gangs. Except for the gangs, right? So they are a minor minority. We should not tolerate, sin like that. And so we have to act with wisdom when we let immigrants in, like you're saying, that they won't be able to de facto ignore our laws, because we all agree that them adhering to our laws is important, whether we want multiculturalism or assimilation or whatever else. And so if we are unwise and we allow them an area where they can effectively ignore our laws, the culture is no longer ours. Like, even if an apartment building it's just an apartment building. That's where all the immigrants are. If it is entirely non-American, it is now entirely some other culture. And we currently think, considering we are Americans, we currently think American culture is the best culture. And so we'd like them to become Americans, but they're not likely to if they're all in an apartment building that isn't American. And so I don't think that there's God's law in this as far as wisdom on how many you let in and where they should live and whatever else. So I think it's kind of difficult to say exactly what immigration policy should be, except that we should clearly act with wisdom and maintain our culture, not for the sake of maintaining our culture, but just in that we think our culture is the best reflection of God's law right now. And so, that's why we're wanting to maintain our culture. It's not because of ethnicity or anything else. It's because we think it's our best estimation of God's law right now. So if we have some immigrants that are more righteous than us and we think that they have better law than ours, I am pro bringing them in so that they destroy American culture and we get, better culture here. But there's just not, name a culture that's better than American culture right now? Peruvian food culture, I guess. But it also comes with Peruvian other culture, and Peruvian other culture has its own issues. Yeah.
With the regarding political budget or whatever, if you took Sweden's paying 34,000 for immigrants to leave, and we have, I'll say 15 million immigrants, some estimates 10 million, some up to 20. 15 million and 34,000 for each, that's I think $500 billion just to maintain the country now that you've already let people in and now that you have to escort them and help them out.
Well, and they probably wouldn't leave for 34,000. It ends up being a bigger issue than that. And you may want them to stay if they have become good, if they've assimilated and added to American culture. So
right.
You don't have to deport all of them, but you have to think of some way, what about the ones that are wicked, right? What about wicked Americans? What do you do about those?
Bring some in, but give them a free Gideon's International Bible. Put God's law in their hands and help them learn a little something.
Well, and as
free.
Yeah, and as you said, Theodore, you can have all the greatest laws in the world, but if you can't enforce them, it doesn't mean anything. So the Bible speaks to this several times in the New Testament, that the government's role is to bear a sword, and it doesn't bear a sword in vain. So we also need to support the government being able to enact the laws that it has on the books to actually do them. And so yes, you have to act with wisdom there to allow the government to do or to support the government doing its work as well. And if an apartment building full of people who don't like the current American government is able to not have the law enforced on them, that's a bad thing. Yeah. Unless the law is wicked, but we all agree that not murdering or not stealing is not a wicked law. All right, so we've rambled a little bit, but I hope, again, at the beginning of the episode, we said we want you to have some hope for the future of American politics or world politics, and that it's not linchpinning on the number of demographically American Americans, or it doesn't linchpin on the number of demographically Swedes, or it doesn't even it's the linchpin of this issue of making better societies doesn't even depend on presidents or societal studiers or Jeff Bezos's next stock move. It is purely on whether or not a society adheres to God's law, which any people can do, Lord willing. And we pray the Lord does it here. We pray the Lord does it in Sweden. We pray the Lord does it everywhere.
So our call is go out and evangelize. You want to transform the U.S., you want to transform South Korea or Somalia or wherever you're from, evangelize.
Amen.
Let's do it. Let's do it. That's how God starts to use people to transform a society for the better.
Mm-hmm. And as the Psalms say, meditate on God's law yourself, because even if you have a country full of supposed Christians, if they're not actually obeying God's law, they aren't helping society very much. So I would reflect personally on yourself too. I reflect all the time. And as David says, he reflects all the time on God's law. He loves God's law. Let's continue to study God's law so that we ourselves are better reflections of his law as well. And that's why we found our cause in serving the Lord Jesus Christ. I haven't done that in a while. I've been Michael, the man behind the machine, and to my front, it's first
Theodore under the PC.
Nice. And second, it's, but not least,
Sebastian, the archivist.
Thanks for listening. If you want to see the rest of our episodes, you're going to have to go to foundcause.podbean.com and download them all for your listening pleasure. That is audio only, though. We're also on iTunes and Spotify, only audio. If you want to see our beautiful faces and the freeze-ups and whatever else, you can go to YouTube and Facebook.com/foundcause and look up our videos there. So until next time, when we talk about something completely different, thanks for sticking with us. Bye.